Hello everyone. In this video we are going to see how to configure and deploy IBM Spectrum Scale CSI driver with a remotely mounted file system. Here I have a remote cluster setup ready. SRoute 5 is a node which is also part of my Kubernetes cluster and which has Spectrum Scale installed on it. And as you can see, the remote cluster details are as below. The remote cluster name is implied1.fire.ibm.com and the file system that is remotely mounted is implied.fs. The local name of the file system is my implied.fs and the name on the remote cluster is implied.fs. It is mounted locally on this mount point. Now let's see overall file system listing on this cluster. So overall I only have one file system which is my implied.fs and which is remotely mounted from another cluster. So there is no local file system that exists here. Here on the Kubernetes cluster I already have an operator deployed. Please see my first video on installing IBM Spectrum Scale CSI driver to see how to deploy an operator. And now we are going to deploy and configure the driver. So let's open the custom resource file. Here is the custom resource file and let us configure it for our cluster. So in the clusters section, the ID of the first cluster that we are giving is of the local cluster. So let's check the local cluster ID. So this ID is the one that I have specified in the ID field. Secret is the GUI secret is the secret for the Spectrum Scale GUI server running on the local cluster. Here I have already created the Kubernetes secret resource. Please see my first video on installing CSI Spectrum Scale driver on how to create secrets. I've configured it with secure SSL mode as true and CS certificate has also been created and the name is CS Cert. Again, you can watch my earlier video on how to configure CSI driver with SSL mode to communicate with GUI. That will show you how to create the CS certificate. Next, let's configure the primary file system. So we designate this cluster to contain the primary file system. In primary FS, we need to give the name of the file system that is locally mounted. In this case, it is my implied.fs. Let's check if that's true. So my implied.fs is the name on the local cluster, which is what we are giving in primary FS. Primary file set can be anything that you want to designate. It can be pre-existing or if not, the driver will create it. In remote cluster, you need to give the remote cluster ID. So this is my remote cluster, which is implied1, and I give the ID here. And remote FS is only needed if your remote file system name is different than the primary file system. In our case, that is true. So my remote file system name is implied.fs. So that's what we need to give here. And in the REST API, the GUI host is the GUI server host on the local cluster. Now this is the configuration of a primary cluster. Now we should configure the remote cluster. For that, we need to make an entry for the remote cluster, give the ID of the remote cluster, then followed by secret, I've already created a secret object for this. And I have not configured secure SSL mode for this cluster. So I set it to false. And since there is no secure SSL mode, I am not giving CA certificate. Now there is no need to give the primary section here. Remember, if there are multiple clusters being configured, only one of them can have the primary section. Now next I need to give the REST API. In that GUI host, and my GUI host is implied one. Alright, so this is our multiple cluster configuration. Now one important thing that we need to configure is scale host path. Scale host path is the mount path of the file system, primary file system on the local cluster. So on my local cluster, the file system is mounted under this path, which is what we need to configure here. Alright, so this is our configuration. First, let's check if there is anything in that file system. So there is only root file set. There are no other file sets that exist in my implied FS. Now let's apply this custom resource. Okay, the custom resource is created, and let us check what is the status of the pod. So in a few seconds, the pods, you should be able to see the pods coming into running state. You can now see that the pods are in running state and the CSI driver is initialized. Now let's check if the file set is created. So our file set CSI set is created and linked at this path.